Mark Thompson had always been a man of routine. His life was simple, predictable, and peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos he dealt with daily as a state trooper. Every morning, he woke up at 5:30 a.m., brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat on his front porch, watching the sunrise over the rolling hills that surrounded his countryside home. The house itself wasn't fancy, just a modest two-story structure with chipped paint and creaky floorboards, but it was his sanctuary. Nestled at the end of a long gravel driveway, it offered him the solitude he craved after years of patrolling highways, breaking up fights, and handling emergencies. The driveway was one of Mark's favorite features of the property. It stretched nearly a quarter-mile from the main road to his house, flanked by tall oak trees that created a natural tunnel of shade during the summer months. It wasn't just functional, it was symbolic. To Mark, the driveway represented privacy, a clear boundary between his world and everyone else's. He rarely saw cars turning onto it unless they belonged to close friends or family. Neighbors occasionally waved as they drove past on the main road, but no one ever ventured down the driveway without permission. That's why, on this particular Saturday morning, Mark felt a pang of curiosity when he noticed a line of vehicles parked haphazardly along the edge of his property. At first, he thought maybe someone had broken down or needed directions, but as he stepped outside in his boots and jeans, coffee mug in hand, he realized something far more unusual was happening. A group of people milled about near the entrance to his driveway, setting up tables, chairs, and even a small tent. Music blared faintly in the background, and laughter echoed through the crisp morning air. Mark frowned, confused. What exactly was going on here? Walking closer, he spotted Karen Harper standing near the makeshift setup, barking orders at a couple of younger men struggling to unfold a folding table. Karen was a neighbor, though not one Mark particularly cared for. She lived a few miles away in a sprawling ranch-style home, and was known for her bossy demeanor and knack for stirring up drama. Mark had exchanged pleasantries with her once or twice, but their interactions were always brief and polite. Still, seeing her now, directing what looked like some kind of event on his asterisk land, left him baffled. "Excuse me," Mark called out, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the commotion. "What's all this?" Karen turned to face him, her expression shifting from irritation to mild annoyance. "Oh, hi, Mark," she said dismissively, barely sparing him a glance. "We're hosting a little get-together today. Don't worry, it won't last too long." Mark blinked, taken aback. "A get-together? On my driveway?" Karen waved a hand as if swatting away a fly. "Relax, it's fine. We're not hurting anything. Besides, isn't this basically public space anyway?" Mark's jaw tightened. Public space, his driveway. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Setting his coffee mug down on the hood of his truck, he crossed his arms and took a step forward. This was his property, plain and simple, and no amount of Karen's entitled attitude was going to change that. Little did he know, this conversation was only the beginning of a day that would spiral into utter absurdity and leave Karen regretting she'd ever picked a fight with a state trooper. Mark stood there, trying to process what Karen had just said. Public space, his driveway. The idea was so ridiculous that for a moment, he wondered if he'd misheard her. But no, Karen's dismissive tone and casual shrug made it clear. She genuinely believed she could treat his private property however she pleased. Mark took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. After all, he dealt with difficult people every day in his line of work. He wasn't about to let Karen rattle him. "Karen," he began, his voice steady but firm, "this isn't public space. This is my driveway, my private property. You can't just set up an event here without asking." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically, as though Mark were being unreasonable. "Oh, come on, Mark. It's not like you're using it right now. And besides, we're not doing any harm. We're just having a little fun." "A little fun," Mark echoed, glancing around at the growing crowd. There were at least 20 people milling about, some carrying coolers, others setting up lawn chairs. A portable speaker blasted music loud enough to echo off the trees. One man was even grilling burgers near the edge of Mark's property, smoke curling into the air. Fun didn't quite cover it. This looked more like a full-blown party. Mark shook his head. "I don't care how much fun you're having. This is my land, and I didn't give anyone permission to use it. I need you to pack up and leave." Karen crossed her arms, her lips tightening into a thin line. "You're being ridiculous, Mark. Nobody owns a driveway this long. It's basically part of the road anyway. Stop being so selfish." Selfish? Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd lived here for over a decade, paid taxes on this property, maintained the driveway himself after every storm, and yet Karen had the audacity to call him selfish. Part of him wanted to argue further, to explain exactly why she was wrong, but he knew it wouldn't do any good. People like Karen never listened. They only cared about getting their way. Instead, Mark decided to take matters into his own hands. Without another word, he walked over to his truck, which was parked near the entrance of the driveway. Climbing into the driver's seat, he started the engine and slowly pulled forward until the truck blocked the entire width of the driveway. Then he turned off the ignition, stepped out, and leaned casually against the hood, crossing his arms again. Karen stared at him, her mouth dropping open in disbelief. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Making sure no one else drives onto my property," Mark replied matter-of-factly. "If you want to have your event, fine. But it ends here, at the edge of my driveway." The guests who had been arriving in cars began to slow down, unsure of what to do. Some looked annoyed, while others seemed amused by the standoff. Karen, meanwhile, turned bright red, her cheeks puffing out like a balloon ready to burst. She stormed over to Mark, pointing a finger at him accusingly. "You can't just block us," she snapped. "This is harassment." Mark raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Harassment? Last I checked, blocking access to private property isn't harassment. It's called protecting my rights. If you don't like it, feel free to call the cops." And with that, Mark picked up his coffee mug and took a sip, watching as Karen fumed. She muttered something under her breath before pulling out her phone and jabbing at the screen with trembling fingers. Mark couldn't help but smirk. Little did Karen know, calling the police was the last thing she should have done. Karen's fingers flew across her phone screen as she dialed the local police department. Her face was flushed with anger, and her voice trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher on the other end of the line. "Yes, hello. I need to report a situation," she began, her tone dripping with indignation. "There's a man blocking my event, on purpose. He's being completely unreasonable and aggressive." Mark watched from his spot, leaning against the truck, sipping his coffee. He couldn't hear exactly what Karen was saying, but her exaggerated hand gestures and dramatic expressions told him everything he needed to know. She was painting him as some kind of villain, spinning the story to make herself look like the victim. It was almost comical how hard she was trying to twist the truth. "Aggressive," Mark muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "If standing on your own property is considered aggressive these days, then I guess we're living in a whole new world." As Karen continued her call, Mark noticed a few of the guests whispering among themselves. Some looked embarrassed, while others seemed annoyed that their plans for the day had been disrupted. A couple of them glanced at Mark curiously, perhaps wondering who this quiet man with the calm demeanor really was. None of them knew he was a state trooper, and Mark didn't feel the need to announce it. Let Karen dig her own hole. That was fine by him. About 15 minutes later, the distant wail of sirens broke through the morning air. 2 patrol cars appeared down the road, their flashing lights reflecting off the trees as they approached. Karen straightened up immediately, smoothing her hair and plastering on a smug smile. She clearly thought she'd won the battle before it had even begun. As the officers stepped out of their vehicles, she marched over to greet them, pointing dramatically at Mark. "There he is," Karen exclaimed, her voice rising with self-righteous fury. "That man is refusing to let us use the driveway for parking, even though it's public space. He parked his truck there on purpose to block us, and now he's ruining my entire event." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a young man named Officer Daniels, whom Mark recognized from the station, nodded politely and turned toward Mark. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" Mark set his coffee mug down on the hood of his truck and stood up straight, brushing off his jeans. He offered the officers a small, knowing smile. "Of course," he said calmly. "This is my driveway, my private property. These folks decided to host an event without asking permission, and when I asked them to leave, they refused. So I parked my truck here to prevent further trespassing." Officer Daniels frowned slightly, glancing between Mark and Karen. "Do you have proof that this is your property?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Without hesitation, Mark reached into the cab of his truck and pulled out a folder containing documents related to his property ownership. He handed them to the officer, who flipped through them quickly. Meanwhile, Karen hovered nearby, growing increasingly agitated. "This is ridiculous," she blurted out. "He's making a scene over nothing. We weren't hurting anything." The second officer, a veteran named Lieutenant Harris, spoke up, his voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, if this is indeed private property, then the owner has every right to deny access. If you're using someone else's land without permission, that's considered trespassing." Karen's jaw dropped. "Trespassing? But he's harassing us." At this point, Mark decided it was time to clarify things further, for everyone's benefit. With a slight chuckle, he cleared his throat and addressed the officers directly. "Gentlemen, there's something else you should probably know." He paused for effect, letting the tension build just a little longer. "I'm Sergeant Mark Thompson. I work with the state police." The reaction was immediate. Both officers' eyes widened in recognition, and they exchanged another glance, this one filled with amusement. Officer Daniels coughed to hide a laugh, while Lieutenant Harris gave Mark a respectful nod. "Well, that explains a lot," he said dryly. Karen, meanwhile, froze mid-protest, her mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. For once, she was utterly speechless. The air seemed to freeze as Karen processed what Mark had just said. Her face turned an even deeper shade of red, and her hands dropped limply to her sides. For someone who thrived on drama and control, this was uncharted territory. She hadn't expected the obstacle she'd called the cops on to be one of ***. The officers, now fully aware of who they were dealing with, shifted their focus back to Karen with a mix of professionalism and barely concealed amusement. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Harris began, his tone firmer now, "you mentioned earlier that this man was harassing you. Can you explain exactly what actions he took that made you feel threatened?" Karen stammered, struggling to find words. She glanced around at the growing audience of curious partygoers, clearly hoping for support, but most of them were too busy whispering among themselves or trying not to laugh outright. Finally, she blurted out, He blocked us. He parked his truck right there and refused to move it. That's harassment." Mark raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against his truck again. "Refusing to let strangers use my private property isn't harassment," he said calmly. "It's enforcing my rights as a property owner." Lieutenant Harris nodded in agreement. Turning back to Karen, he added, "Blocking access to private property when it's being used without permission is well within the law, ma'am. In fact, Sergeant Thompson would have every right to press charges if he felt his property was being trespassed upon." Karen's eyes widened in panic. "Press charges? For what? We weren't doing anything wrong." Officer Daniels stepped forward, holding up the folder of documents Mark had provided. "Actually, according to these records, this driveway and the surrounding area is legally owned by Sergeant Thompson. Hosting an event here without his consent constitutes trespassing and making a false report to law enforcement." He trailed off meaningfully, letting the implication sink in. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "False report. I didn't lie. I just I thought. You thought wrong, Mark interjected smoothly, his voice still calm but laced with quiet authority. You assumed this was public space, ignored my request to leave, and then called the police claiming I was harassing you, all while using my property without permission. The weight of the situation finally hit Karen, and she deflated visibly. For all her bravado, she wasn't prepared to face the consequences of overplaying her hand. Still, she tried one last desperate attempt to save face. Well, maybe I misunderstood, she muttered, avoiding eye contact. But you didn't have to make such a big deal out of it. Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head. Karen, if you'd simply asked to use the driveway, or even apologize when I pointed out the misunderstanding, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Instead, you doubled down and involved the police unnecessarily. That's not my fault. It's yours. Lieutenant Harris nodded, crossing his arms. Ma'am, we'll need to document this incident. With the officers gone and the crowd thinning out, Mark stood by his truck, arms crossed, watching as Karen scrambled to salvage what was left of her ruined event. The once lively gathering had devolved into chaos, with guests awkwardly packing up coolers, folding chairs and decorations. Some muttered quiet apologies to Mark as they passed, while others avoided eye contact altogether, clearly embarrassed by the whole ordeal. The music had been turned off, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Karen, however, wasn't ready to let go of her indignation. She hovered near the edge of the driveway, glaring at Mark as though he were the villain of the story rather than the rightful owner of the property she trespassed on. Her voice rose again, shrill and defensive, as she addressed a small group of friends who lingered nearby. I can't believe this. He's so petty. Who does something like this to ruin someone else's day? Mark raised an eyebrow, but chose not to engage. He'd already said his piece, and there was no point arguing with someone who refused to see reason. Instead, he leaned against his truck, sipping the last dregs of his now cold coffee, content to let Karen dig herself deeper into her own hole. Truthfully, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. One of Karen's friends, a middle-aged woman clutching a tote bag filled with plastic cups, finally worked up the courage to approach him. Mr. Thompson. She began hesitantly, glancing over her shoulder at Karen, who was still ranting in the background. I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about all this. We didn't mean any harm. We honestly thought it was okay to park here. Mark softened slightly, offering her a small, polite smile. It's fine, he said. Mistakes happen. But next time, maybe check first before using someone else's property. The woman nodded vigorously. Of course, absolutely. And thank you for being so understanding. She paused, then added sheepishly, though I have to admit, none of us expected the guy blocking the driveway to be a state trooper. Mark chuckled lightly, shaking his head. Believe me, neither did Karen. As the woman hurried back to join her group, Karen shot Mark another venomous glare. Clearly, she hadn't missed the exchange. Determined to have the final word, she marched over to him, hands planted firmly on her hips. You know, she snapped, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Some people might call this abuse of power. Mark blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of her accusation. Abuse of power. All he'd done was stand up for his rights as a property owner. And somehow, he was the bad guy. Shaking his head, he replied evenly. Karen, if standing on my own land and enforcing my rights is abuse of power, then we've got bigger problems than this little misunderstanding. Karen opened her mouth to retort but stopped short, seemingly realizing that anything she said would only make her look worse. Instead, she huffed loudly and spun on her heel, stalking back toward her car. A few of her friends followed reluctantly, casting apologetic glances at Mark as they went. By noon, the driveway was completely cleared. Chairs, tables, and tents were loaded back into vehicles, and the last of the guests drove away, leaving behind only tire tracks and a faint smell of charcoal from the abandoned grill. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the morning lift. It had been a strange and frustrating few hours, but he couldn't deny it had also been oddly satisfying. Not because he'd won some kind of battle, but because he'd stood his ground without stooping to Karen's level. Still leaning against his truck, Mark surveyed the empty driveway and shook his head with a wry smile. Well, he muttered to himself, that's one way to start a Saturday. As the last car pulled away, leaving behind only silence and the faint crunch of gravel underfoot, Mark finally allowed himself to relax. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp during the confrontation with Karen began to fade, replaced by a mix of amusement and disbelief. He shook his head as he walked over to where the event had been set up just hours earlier. Empty soda cans, crumpled napkins, and a few stray plastic cups littered the ground near the edge of his driveway, reminders of the chaos Karen had brought to his otherwise peaceful weekend. Mark sighed, bending down to pick up some of the trash. It wasn't much, but it still grated on him. This was his property, his sanctuary, and now it bore the marks of someone else's carelessness. Still, he reminded himself that holding on to anger wouldn't do any good. People like Karen thrived on stirring up drama. Giving her the satisfaction of ruining his day would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on cleaning up, methodically gathering the scattered items and tossing them into a nearby trash bag. By the time he finished, the driveway looked almost back to normal, though the memory of the morning lingered in the air. Mark leaned against his truck again, letting the quietness of the countryside wash over him. Birds chirped in the distance, and the gentle rustle of leaves provided a soothing soundtrack to the aftermath of the bizarre scene. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect, not just on what had happened, but on how quickly things could spiral out of control when people refused to respect boundaries. Despite everything, Mark couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Who would have thought that parking his truck across his own driveway would lead to such a spectacle? And who would have guessed that Karen, a woman known for her entitled attitude, would call the police on *him*, of all people? The irony wasn't lost on him. If anything, the situation reinforced something he'd always believed. No matter how calm and reasonable you were, there would always be people who tried to push their way through life without considering others. As the afternoon wore on, Mark decided to take a drive into town. He figured a change of scenery might help clear his head after the morning's events. Plus, he needed to grab a few groceries anyway. As luck would have it, he ran into Officer Daniels at the local gas station. The young officer grinned widely when he spotted Mark filling up his tank. "Hey, Sarge," Daniels called out, walking over. "How's your Saturday going now that you're not playing traffic cop on your own driveway?" Mark laughed, shaking his head. "Better, thanks. Though I gotta say, I didn't expect my weekend to include crowd control." Daniels chuckled, leaning against the pump next to him. "You handled it like a pro. Harris and I were talking about it after we left. Gotta admit, it's not every day you see someone pull rank without even trying." Mark shrugged modestly. It wasn't about pulling rank. It was about standing my ground. People need to learn that private property means exactly that. Private. "Well, lesson learned for Karen," Daniels said with a smirk. "She won't be forgetting this anytime soon." The two men chatted for a while longer before parting ways, and Mark headed home feeling lighter than he had all day. Back at the house, he settled onto his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The driveway stretched out before him, empty and peaceful once more. Life had returned to normal, or as normal as it ever got. Mark smiled to himself, thinking about how the story would spread around the neighborhood. By Monday morning, everyone would know about Karen's epic misstep. Some might laugh, others might shake their heads, but one thing was certain. No one would forget the day Karen called the cops on a state trooper for blocking her event, only to realize she'd picked the wrong driveway to mess with. The story of Karen's ill-fated event spread like wildfire through the small community. By Monday morning, it seemed everyone had heard about the neighbor who tried to commandeer a state trooper's driveway and failed spectacularly. At the local diner, farmers sipped coffee and chuckled over the tale. Office workers swapped details during lunch breaks, adding their own embellishments each time it was retold. Even kids on the school bus whispered about how that lady got burned when she messed with Sergeant Thompson. Mark, for his part, didn't go out of his way to share what happened. He wasn't one to boast or seek attention, but he also didn't shy away from answering questions when asked. When a coworker at the station teased him about becoming a local legend, Mark simply shrugged with a grin. "I just stood my ground," he said. "If anything, I think Karen taught us all a lesson." Though I doubt she meant to. And indeed, Karen did seem to have learned her lesson, at least temporarily. In the days following the incident, she avoided eye contact whenever Mark passed by on the road. Her usual confident stride faltered if they crossed paths at the grocery store or post office. Once, Mark caught her staring at him from across the parking lot, only for her to quickly duck behind her car when their eyes met. It was almost comical, watching someone so bold suddenly turn timid. But the real takeaway from the whole ordeal went beyond Karen's bruised ego. For Mark, it reinforced something he'd always believed. Boundaries mattered. Whether it was protecting your property, standing up for yourself, or simply treating others with respect, life worked better when people acknowledged those invisible lines that kept chaos at bay. And while he never wanted trouble, he also knew that staying silent in the face of injustice only encouraged more of it. Over time, the story became less about Karen's blunder and more about Mark's calm handling of the situation. Neighbors began looking at him with newfound admiration, not because he was a state trooper, but because he'd handled everything with grace and professionalism. One elderly couple even stopped by his house to thank him for setting an example. "It's nice to see someone stand firm without losing their cool," the man said, tipping his hat. "You've reminded us all why respect is important." As weeks turned into months, the memory of the driveway debacle faded into the background, but not entirely. Every now and then, someone would mention it jokingly, often during neighborhood gatherings. Mark took it all in stride, laughing along with the rest. But privately, he appreciated the deeper meaning behind the laughter. Stories like these had a way of sticking around, serving as gentle reminders to everyone involved. In the end, the driveway remained exactly as it always had been, a quiet stretch of gravel leading to Mark's home. But its significance had grown. To Mark, it symbolized resilience and conviction. To Karen, it likely served as a reminder of humility and caution. And to the rest of the community, it became a shared piece of folklore, a funny yet meaningful story about what happens when assumptions collide with reality. Life returned to its peaceful rhythm, and Mark couldn't be happier. His weekends were once again filled with sunrises, coffee, and solitude. The only difference, now, every time he drove down his driveway, he allowed himself a small smile, knowing it had played a starring role in a story no one would soon forget.